Now, the thing is, when we hit in the 90s, that it kind of went to the next step. How many of you heard of Dr. Beloit, right? And basically saying, well, you know what, there comes a time when someone, because of pain or because of dignity, that death is not coming soon, but we should allow them to take their own lives or help them to do that, to assist them in that, right? And you know, it's a society that where we wrestled with this. In fact, in the Netherlands, they actually have laws that allow people to do this. One of the things I remember in the class I had in Issues in Living and Dying is bringing up, though, you know, what does that mean? You know, when is life got to a point where you just can't go on, even though your body still will function? And I remember the professor sharing this story about a man who was writing about his dog. And how many of you have dogs? And I know Jackson right now. You know, right? But he was sharing about the dog. The dog had gotten very old and it was very feeble, and in the middle of winter was in great pain, and they really thought about putting the dog down. Now that's also a way that we use, you know, about taking the life of the dog, about killing the dog. And they really wrestled with this, and they decided to not do that. And when spring came, the dog it perked up. It's like this second wind, this new life came, and they had the most wonderful summer together, and it was out again, being able to play and be in the yard, and then this fall came, you know, the dog declined and died on its own. And the author, the guy writing the story about this experience, says, you know, if we had chosen to take the dog's life, you know, back in the winter, we would have missed out on that in the time that we had together. I think the other thing, though, that we have to wrestle with, and that is, are the things we learn from this experience? You know, that going through the struggle. And I remember hearing the story of this nun who had gotten, I think it was cancer, and it was a very, you know, a difficult journey as she went through this and talked about it as she was coming towards the end of her life, and sharing that, you know, she was so glad to have gone through this because of the things that she learned that she would never have seen if she hadn't gone through that, which I think is the thing that's often hard for us. You know, one of the things, having worked in the at a cancer hospital and talking to doctors, even in the 90s, who are sharing that still many doctors don't realize, is we have come to the point where the whole issue of pain is really no longer an issue. That with what we call palliative care, that we can actually deal with almost any issue of pain that people have, that you know, dying, you know, feeling that we need our lives taken because we can't deal with the pain is really no longer an issue, not like it once was. It really comes to the issue of how do we talk about dignity. And I think in many ways we've done well when we look at things like hospice, that allows people no longer to have to die in the hospital, to be able to be in their homes, to have care to deal with those pains, and to be with their family in their last days. But I think one of the stories when we talk about the whole issue of dignity is, you know, we live in a society where we have these expectations of how things should go. If I can't care for myself anymore, is life really worth living? And you know, I think sometimes there are things that we go through that help us to find that there is more than life than those things. That often when we go through those struggles in life, that we come to a place of realizing that the things we thought mattered didn't really matter. You know, and so there's, you know, really, I think in many ways, the way our courts have decided is have come down in the right way of saying, you know, first, we need to be able to allow people to die when the time has come. That, like it says in Ecclesiastes, there's a time for everything, a time to be born and a time to die. And when that time comes, we need to let people go the journey. But also that we don't short-circuit that and do that too soon. The other thing I think, and Wayne's going to be talking about this more as we go down the road in a couple of weeks, is where we've come to now, and that is when we come up with the issue of health care. And whereas in the 70s, doctors did extreme measures to keep people alive even when they felt that the end had really come. And, you know, and that only these machines were keeping their bodies alive even when there was no one there anymore. That now we actually see some other things happening, and that's where people are being denied treatment to save their lives because they can't afford it. And I think we need to wrestle with that as well. You know, that's being used by the profession to say, well, we think it's not going to make it because we, you know what, insurance isn't going to cover it, we can't afford it, and so I don't know if we're going to cover that for somebody. And I think that's the next place we need to wrestle with is a society. For us as people of faith, though, I think we need to talk about what does it mean that life is sacred, and how has the scripture, how are people of faith viewed this? And I want to bring up a couple of texts here just to talk about this, because this is not something new to us. The people have had to wrestle with this issue of life at the end. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul writes, and the very last enemy is death. You know, if you read the stories of the scriptures, you can just hold that there. in the beginning it talks about God creating the world, and there's this life, and Adam and Eve, basically the sense that they would live forever until they make choices not to do what God, has called them to. And as a result, it says what we call the fall, that death comes into the world. And see that this is part of the brokenness, but it's not the way God intended things to be. Death is not the way God intended. And what Paul is writing is saying that out of Jesus now, though, that death is going to be defeated, that this enemy that we've had since the beginning is going to be undone. And so, as people of faith, we have, said we need to resist death. Next one. There's also a story where Jesus is out doing his ministry, and John's in prison, and John's disciples come to Jesus because they'd expect this message of judgment, and instead Jesus is healing people, raising the dead, and they said, "Are you the one?" And he responds by saying, "Go back and tell John what you've just seen and heard. The blind see, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the wretched of the earth have God's salvation, hospitality extended to them." That what we see in Jesus is this message of God who comes bringing life, and this promise of life and of healing, right? And I can still remember when I went to India. It was amazing to see. We went there, and people who were lepers were given medicine that didn't cure them, but it kept it from spreading and allowed them to be with their families. People who were lame were walking because of artificial limbs. People who were blind, just were given glasses so they could see. And people who would have died from easily curable things were being cared for. And we saw these things actually happening, and the hope that people have. I think the message that you see in Jesus is this message of hope, of God is about bringing life. Now, go ahead and click this next one if you could. There's a story where a blind man comes to Jesus, and Jesus says, "What can I do for you?" And the blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." I think we've watched this scene before from The Life of Brian, where there's a guy who's going around saying, "Alms for an ex-leper." And Brian says, "Ex-leper?" He says, "Yep, there I was, minding my own business. As Jesus comes along, heals me, whoop, out of a job." What you actually see in the ministry of Jesus, which I think is very interesting, is he doesn't give care unless the person asks for it. He says to the blind, he says, "Ask him, what can I do for you?" He says, "I want to see." Jesus is very, very concerned that we have a say in this. Now, what's also interesting, go ahead and click the next one. There's a story of Lazarus, and you can just kind of click through it as I talk about it, but in the story of Lazarus is a friend of Jesus. He's also friends with Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha. And they send word to him that Lazarus is very ill, that it looks like he's going to die. And they want Jesus to come to heal him. And any of you know what Jesus says when the messengers come to him? He basically says, "You know what? I'll be there, but it's going to be a few days." And so he waits a few days, and when he comes there, guess what's happened? He's dead. And his sisters come to him saying, "If you'd been here, if you'd come right away, he didn't have to die. You could have saved him." Right? And Jesus basically says something along the lines of, I am the resurrection and life. Whoever believes in me, even though they die, will live. And he comes to the tomb. And the shortest verse of the Bible is, Jesus wept. And people say, "Well, look how deeply he loved him." And he has him roll away the stone, which they don't want to do because he's been dead 3 days. And the King James says, "Surely, he stinketh." That it's going, there's going to be this smell because he's been dead. He's been decomposing. He's rotting. But Jesus has to do it. And he calls him out. And Lazarus comes out. And he says, unwrap him, let him set him free. And I think what's interesting in this, first off, is when you think about the story of Lazarus, think about all the people Jesus healed. Do you know where all those people are right now? They're all dead. Every single miracle that Jesus performed was undone by death. Even Lazarus, who he brought back from the dead, is dead. I think you realize how many people there were in Jesus' time who were sick, who died, who suffered these illnesses that Jesus didn't heal. That I think one of the things we think that this is just about, like the one with Benny Hinn, that you have faith to get healed. What Jesus is really doing, I think, is saying something deeper. He's saying, look, for one thing, death isn't quite the enemy that we think it is. Do you know what the early Christians wore to weddings? To funerals? They wore white. And we wear white to weddings and black to funerals. They wore white to funerals. I wonder if they wore black to weddings.
Yes, they did. They wore black to weddings.
You know, and part of the reason they wore white to funerals was it was a celebration, because you know what? This is what we've been waiting for. In fact, there's a verse. Go ahead and click on you can skip over this to the next verse where not from John, but there's one a little further down in Philippians, I think it is, where Paul basically says, in the version I memorized, it's not the same as up here, but we would often read these at funerals, would say, Paul writes, "For me to live is Christ and to die is gain." And there's this great section, actually, we're almost there. If you click the little arrow on the left-hand side, it'll close that one down, and you can see where it says Philippians down further there, Tori. Sorry about that. I kind of went faster than you can click through here in this. But basically, when people look at the stories of Jesus, we understand that what Jesus was doing with the healings was not just about healing. It was about God's kingdom breaking into the world, about God, about renewing and bringing new life. But also that this life is not all that matters. Paul writes, he says, "Alive, I'm Christ's messenger." He said, "Dead, I'm his bounty. Life versus even more life. I can't lose." Right? I shared the story. It was one of my first airplane flights. First time I was in a storm, nobody else I knew, and I didn't realize that the wings are supposed to actually go like this. Did you know that? They're supposed to be able to flex. Before you get in the next plane, remember that story. But so I'm looking at the window, which I'm right in the wing. This wing is going like this. I'm thinking that thing's coming off. This is it. Storm. I'm nervous. I'm up on my toes and just scared up. And some things I'm sitting there. This kind of thought comes to mind. I said, well, if I live, great. I get to live for God, and if I die, I get to go with Jesus. You can't lose. And so I'm sitting there. I can literally remember being in this chair, and I was kind of getting excited, thinking, I wonder which it's going to be. I don't know. We'll have to see or find out. We'll be one to the other. Now, Paul isn't saying, you know what, I'm ready to die and just go take my life because it's better, to be there. What he's saying is, look, to live in this life is a wonderful thing, to be able to live out what God has called us to in this life. But he said, to go and be with Jesus is a wonderful thing. He says, and that's what we wait for. But it comes in its own time. It comes in its own time that, there's a time to be born, there's a time to die. He says, and so, I wait for it. It will come. He says, in some ways I can't wait, yet I do, because it will come in its own time. I think too often we've been so focused on, this fear of death that we don't realize that it also comes as a gift. That, quite honestly, how many of us would want to be here forever? Right? There's great stories about this. You look at it, it's like, there's something about it, I think, in some ways that death comes is a gift of, when only that we die, we appreciate what we have and what life is so much more. And we also hope beyond. And we live out of that and share that hope with others. And so, in Revelation, the last book of the Bible, it says this. It says, He'll wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death is gone for good. Tears gone. Crying gone. Pain gone. All the first order of things gone. Right? And I think when we're dealing with this issue of life at its end, we have this realization that death has its time and its place. And we should not hold people here longer than they're meant to. There's a time when death is come. But also that it's not something that we seek early, that life is a gift that God gives, and there are things that God invites us to learn in the journey. And sometimes even the most difficult things we go through. Like Jody, you were talking about earlier, as we talk about people we know going through difficult things, that sometimes it's going through those things that we learn something that helps bring us to a new place. The Lord be with you. Thank you. Let's pray. We are on a journey in this life where we face difficult things. And we weren't even able this day to talk about issues we deal with in our society, people as they come near the end of life, about what kind of care we provide people in the last years of their life. But we also know that we need to talk about what it means when we come to that time when we need to let go. Not that we take life, but that we let death come when the time has come. And we ask that you would help us as people of faith to